YouTube, and welcome to Logos Live, a series on analytic philosophy and the relationship between language and metaphysics. I'm here with Frege, who is a grad student whose focus in his studies is analytic philosophy. So the text we were reading today was J.L. Austin's How to Do Things with Words. This book, which is based on a series of lectures given at Harvard in 1955, is, I think, one of the cornerstones of 20th century analytic philosophy, and in what it says about how language doesn't just describe the world but also influences it. So what were your first impressions of J.L. Austin's How to Do Things with Words?
So I think that the general view of, well, most people was that the sort of, he outlines the distinction between what was classically believed about propositional statements, which was essentially that everything is a propositional statement or it's nonsense. And I think that for a very long time, like starting at the beginning of the 20th century, end of the 19th century, a lot of people realized that was not the way things were, that in fact there were quite sensible statements that could be uttered that could not easily be categorized as true or false. And I think Austin does a fairly good job of outlining what some of those statements could be. So yeah, I think on that front, he provides a pretty plausible account. I will say the weakest portion, I think, of his argument starts when he's talking about, whoop, drop my pencil. The weakest portion of his argument is when he's talking about felicity, which we can probably get into a bit later. But what exactly constitutes? Well, should we explain what constitutives are and what performatives are first?
Yeah, I think that's a good place to begin.
Okay.
So
you
like,
want to do it, or should I?
Well, so basically, we all understand in some sense sentences like Jimmy's dog is brown, right? And we understand that this statement, Jimmy's dog is brown, is referring to something in the world, Jimmy's dog, and making a statement about it. And we can say, well, the statement is true or false, and we can know it's true or false if we actually go see Jimmy's dog, and, we can verify whether it's, brown or not.
Right.
So for a long time, it was kind of figured that all sentences kind of work like that, right? Or all statements, and if they don't, then they're not really meaningful statements. But am I right?
Yeah.
Or
No. All of that is true, and the view was essentially that it's true, it's false, or it's nonsensical. Right? There are a lot of statements that you can't know the truth value of, like that I don't know, space. There's an infinite amount of space, or there's a finite amount of space. I mean, that's true or false, but we just don't know the truth value of it. But it is hypothetically true or false. But you could also have a statement that's nonsense. So the famous Chomsky statement is colorless green ideas sleep furiously. Is that statement true or false? It's gibberish.
Yes. So we might understand all the words in that sentence, but because of the way they're put together, it doesn't actually create meaning, even if it may appear to be meaningful.
It is grammatically correct, but not significant.
Right.
Yeah.
But what Austin points out in this book is that there's some statements we make that do seem to have some kind of meaning that at least we use and we talk about, but they don't seem to be true or false. Right. One example he gives are what he calls performative statements. And perhaps the classic example is, I promise you that I'll pay you back. Now, is it I guess we could say it's true or false that I'll pay you back, but the I promise is the interesting thing, right? So
right.
if I say I'm making a promise, am I describing something I'm doing, or rather am I actually doing something, which is making the promise?
Yeah, that's what he's describing as a performative act. And he actually sort of addresses one criticism that you can make of that when he's talking about marriage. So when he says marriage is just saying the words "I do" at a marriage ceremony, and that's all you could say. And in that sense, you're making a true statement, because the question is, do you take so and so to be your lawfully wedded wife? And then when you say "I do," you're saying, well, I'm describing a state of affairs, namely that I am taking her to be my lawfully wedded wife. But you're doing a bit more than that, because it's not simply a prediction of future events. You're not saying, I will, cohabit with this person. I will live with this person, and all sorts of other things. You're not saying that will happen. You're promising to do it, right? You're sort of making something incumbent upon yourself. And that's not really a prediction of how things are going to be. It's a statement of how you will act, or rather how you commit yourself to act in the future. He makes a similar statement about ethical statements. So when we say we ought not to murder, that's not saying in the future we will not murder. It's just it's making a statement that might be a bad example, because that statement is true, but it's not a statement that is describing a state of affairs. It's describing something that isn't empirically verifiable, which is what I was getting at with the example. But in this sense, when we make promissory statements, we're actually talking about commitment, and that seems to be a significant fact, even though we're not describing anything in the world, right? Because if you say, I promise to pay you back, which is sort of what he says, right? I promise, if the example he gives is, I bet you sixpence it will rain tomorrow. That's right. That is distinct from the statement, if it rains tomorrow, then I will give you sixpence, because you're not predicting that will happen. You're making a commitment for it to happen, because if you had never said that, and I came by and I said, where's my sixpence? You'd look at me like I was crazy and say, what are you talking about? Right? The point is, in saying something, you commit yourself to doing something. That's the significance of what he calls performative statements, is by virtue of merely saying something, you communicate something significant that doesn't appear to be true or false. It's just communicating a significant fact. So yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, and he makes a really good argument for why, and at least I found it to be a good argument as to why this is true. Because if we say, no, making a promise is, something that happens internally, and vocalizing it is just describing some kind of interior reality, then if someone breaks their promise, they can just say, well, I didn't actually promise. I know I said I'd promise, but I was just, I was wrong. I falsely, I failed to describe the internal reality correctly.
Right, exactly. It's if you don't fulfill your promise is not wrong. I think and therefore you can't really analyze the promise as true, right? If you say, I promise to pay you back and I don't pay you back, then I didn't falsely promise. I just promised, and the promise was not false. The statement, I promise to pay you back, is neither true nor false. It's a commitment. And so I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought.
Well, and this kind of gets into his point of infelicity, which you brought up already.
Yeah.
But so, if these statements aren't true and false, then how do we describe, a broken promise? Or, if it's not false, then what is it?
I tend to think so he doesn't actually talk a great deal about what they are. He mostly says what there aren't, although they aren't. He does talk about conditions that fail, or rather conditions that would make it so that the promise was not an actual promise. And this is where he sort of gets into the topic of infelicity that you were talking about. So for example, when he says, if you just randomly, this is in the second chapter now, when he says, if you just randomly wander into a marriage ceremony and accidentally say the words, I do, and you're not part of the ceremony, you just said it, you didn't commit to marrying someone. Right? Is you didn't actually make a promise. He says there have to be felicitous conditions. But then this I think is the weakest part of his argument. The more you analyze that, the more you sort of think about what felicitous conditions are, that is, the things that make performative statements as opposed to statements which are constitutive, which again means they're either true or false, seems to be entirely dependent on contextual facts, which can very often be somewhat ambiguous, right? So if you say, if you say, I hereby baptize you as John or something like that, and the question is, what if you make that statement, but you're not recognized as a religious authority, and you just say, I hereby baptize you in the name of John? Is your name now John? Is the question. That's where I start to think it gets sort of murky, right? You say,
you're just opening up a Kripke joke there, but we won't.
I sort of am, but maybe a better example. But I'm trying to think. Yeah, go ahead.
He uses a good one, which is naming a ship.
Queen Elizabeth. Yeah.
Yeah. So if if there is a certain ship that is supposed to be like named in 2 days by a captain, by the captain of the ship, and it's going to be the Queen Elizabeth, and I'm just some random passerby, and I decide, hey, you know what, I'm going to do it, even if I perform the ceremony right. I break the bottle on the bow of the ship, and I decide to call the ship, the Joe Stalin, I think is the example he uses.
Yes.
I wasn't the person who was supposed to name the ship. That wasn't the proper name of the ship. And we could say, because it happened on the wrong day, that also plays into effect.
Right. So I think this is what I was saying, why I think his argument is somewhat weak, is it's not clear what constitutive conditions, or I shouldn't say constitutive conditions. I should say, what are the contingent circumstances surrounding the performative act that makes it a performative act, I guess, rather than simply, I don't know, what would it be if you had no authority to name a ship and you say, I hereby dub this ship the Joseph Stalin? What is that? Is that a performative act? Because he seems to say, or rather, it's an infelicitous performative act, is what he seems to say. But the question is it? Yeah. It's still a performative act, isn't it?
So what? At least what the sense I got from the text is, as a Catholic, using sacramental terminology, might call it an invalid performative act. Yeah. He uses the term infelicitous, which I think is a kind of weird term, but it's the one he went with. But the basic idea is, hey, you tried to do something with language, but for some reason, whether your own intentions or the circumstances weren't right, you failed to actually accomplish what you set out to do.
Right. And that sort of gets us into a different discussion about, well, I don't know if you want to go here. I was thinking of externalism, and more specifically the idea that meanings are not determined by the people using the words in question, but I don't know if you want to go there just yet. But yeah, it almost seems as if, well, I'll sort of throw a monkey wrench in what you just said, which is, you gave the example of someone who was not a Catholic priest performing particular sacraments. So for example, if an Eastern Orthodox priest performed those same sacraments, is that an infelicitous sacrament? And the question is, the answer, I would assume, is it depends on who you're asking. And this is where I think we get to the weakness of his argument, which is that it seems to me that performative acts, once we start to talk about distinctions like this, what is a felicitous and infelicitous performative act? I know we're getting deep in the jargon here, but that's what he does. What's felicitous and infelicitous seems to be entirely subjective, right? It seems as if the person who is doing the judging is the one who determines if the act is felicitous, and not the context of the act itself. Do you sort of get what I'm saying, or am I making any sense? Yeah.
Well, I think that's what Austin is trying to avoid. Austin's really trying his hardest, at least in these first two chapters. Later,
he doesn't want to say that.
Yeah, later he admits it gets a little tricky. But at least in the first two chapters, he's trying to, create these objective standards. And he actually creates, kind of a little chart kind of explaining how certain acts can fail, whether because it was, the context is wrong, or whether the words weren't said right, or whether the words were said right, the act did happen, but the person had no intention of carrying them out, or something like that.
Right.
Which is, he notes, is a slightly different circumstance. But I think you bring up a good question that he would have to respond to. So suppose I am this random passerby who calls the ship that was supposed to be called Queen Elizabeth the Joe Stalin, but I also happen to be a huge social media influencer. And so because I do this and I videotape it and I put it online, everyone starts calling the ship the Joe Stalin.
Right.
Where, at a certain point, I can point to that, I can refer to the HMS Joe Stalin or the USS Joe Stalin, which would be hilarious, but the USS Joe Stalin, and people would be like, "Oh, I know what ship you're talking about." So it does seem like I've named it. If we're going to be, and both Vick and not to bring in too many cross references here, but both Wittgenstein and Kripke seem to think names kind of work like that.
Yeah, both of them are not as. Austin doesn't discuss names too specifically, but I think both Kripke and Wittgenstein probably more so than Kripke, would say that the mere use of the name determines the fact that it is the thing that it means that it has that name. I think that Austin very much wants to resist that conclusion. I think because if he doesn't resist that conclusion, then this whole discussion of felicity is pointless. Right. Then it seems to me he doesn't have to talk about felicitous speech at all. Right. Randomly wandering into a wedding ceremony and saying "I do" means that you just committed a speech act, even if you didn't understand the implications of it. But he really doesn't want to say that, and as a result, I'm not entirely sure how he's going to defend from the criticism that ultimately. The felicity of an action, or rather of a speech act, right? The idea that what determines whether a speech act is felicitous or not is entirely determined by the person who's judging it. He's sort of, this is sort of a Euthyphro dilemma here. He doesn't like either option. Mm-hmm. That either he can say it's entirely determined by the felicity of the action is entirely determined by the person judging it, or he can say this entire discussion of felicity is pointless. And either way, I don't think he likes it, and I'm not sure which one he would choose or which conclusion he would resist. Do you have any defense of Austin? Because I didn't see one.
Well, there is a certain sense where he does seem to admit some level of I don't want to say like social relativism, but he's so one of the conditions he says is there must exist an accepted conventional procedure for having a certain conventional effect, and that procedure to include the uttering of certain words by certain persons in certain circumstances, etc. And the particular persons and circumstances in a given case must be appropriate for the invocation of the particular procedure invoked.
Oh, sure, but then the question is what procedure is being followed, and again, you're sort of you're taking a circumlocuitous route to the point I was getting at earlier, which is the conventions that are being followed are the conventions of whoever's doing the judging, right? Mm-hmm. Is in the example you gave, in which the social media user goes up to a ship and says, "I hereby dub this ship the HMS Joseph Stalin." It's just, and the United States government said no, actually, or I guess the British government says no, it's the Queen Elizabeth. It would just depend on who you regard as a better authority to name things. I mean, the better example of this. Do you remember the Bodie McBoatface competition? It was where everyone there were a bunch of British researchers who held a contest and let the public name their ship that they were going, their research vessel that they were going to sail to the Antarctic, and the public, the internet, decided to name it Bodie McBoatface, and the scientists rejected that name and substituted a different one because they were not calling a research vessel Bodie McBoatface. So the question is the internet right or are the scientists? And why? And the answer to that question seems to be there's no answer. There's no particular reason why either one is correct. It just depends on whose authority you accept and who you think is better authorized to answer that question.
Well, so from Austin's perspective, it seems to me you could tackle this two ways. You could say, according to his criteria A2, the particular persons and circumstances must be appropriate. So right. We could say, well, the scientists are the appropriate ones, to judge what the name of their boat is. So, it's whatever the real name happened to be. I don't remember what it was.
I don't remember either, but that's not the point. Let's just say it's the Queen Elizabeth for simplicity's sake.
Yeah. Whereas according to his first one, there must exist an accepted conventional procedure having a certain conventional effect. Mm-hmm. It seems to me that when they did this poll, they invoked a conventional procedure. And it didn't go the way they wanted to. But once you've invoked the procedure, there could be an Austinian argument for saying, well, the Speech Act happened, according to that procedure. And so it did have the conventional effect, which is that people still refer to it as Bodie McBoatface.
Yes. But the question is, what's the convention? Is the convention the poll, or is the convention the scientists get to name their ship and they get to use whatever means, including a poll, to determine what the name of their ship is?
Yeah, which...
And again, the only point I wanted to make was there's no answer to that question. It just depends on what you think the authority in this circumstance is. Is it the public or is it the scientists? Did the scientists relinquish their right to name the ship by holding a public poll? Or did they always have the right to decide on the name of the ship and simply ask the public for advice? There's no right answer to that question.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think Austin kind of fails to really... I think Austin really fails to address that point.
Yeah, and honestly, I think it's a very difficult point to address. I don't want to get too far into this, but that's going to come up in... So I actually didn't know if these were related, but it turns out there are. Austin's concept, they are. Austin's concept of performativity and Judith Butler's concept of performativity. And I think it's a problem very much related to this that is going to get Austin into waters he doesn't want to go into, right?
Okay.
That Felicity. Are you familiar with Judith Butler's performativity, or am I?
No. Can you expand on that?
Oh, sure. It's in a very different area. It's actually Judith Butler was the one who wrote Gender Trouble, which I don't know if you remember. It's the idea of gender as a performance. She has this idea that that what it means to be a man or to be a woman is fundamentally determined by one's performance, how one acts, right? And this is where a lot of I'm thinking of a way to say this. Ideas about transgender people come from from specifically that book, which I have read. And the idea is by simply doing something, and she actually got this idea from Austen, is that by simply acting a certain way or doing a certain thing, one performs a gender. One performs the gender of a man by acting as a man. And that is what it means to be a man. And one performs the gender of a woman by acting as a woman. And that is that is what constitutes being a woman. The action itself is a form of performativity, in the same way as saying "I promise" is a form of performativity. "I promise" is itself an action. In the same way, identifying as something is itself an action, or rather, acting as something makes you that thing. This is sort of I'd heard the term performativity before, and I had to do some research into this, and it turns out I actually didn't know that Butler got the concept from Austen. Granted, she applied it in a very different area of philosophy, but it's sort of this difficulty of what constitutes a felicitous action that gets Austen into the kind of situations where you can have a concept of performativity in which the only felicitous action required. Right. So the question is, who determines your identity when we're getting into discussions of performativity? The question is, who determines how I perform? And the answer is me. And therefore, by performing in that sense, by acting in the way that I do, I become that thing. I'm getting a bit abstract, and I read the book several years ago, so I apologize for my butchering of Butler, but it's actually a related concept that's related in a very strange way, because Austen's talking about sort of concepts of language, and then all of a sudden over here we're into philosophy of sex and gender that came out of nowhere, but that has the same basic idea at its core, which is there are statements, or in Butler's case, actions, which are neither true and false or false in and of themselves, but in and of themselves are nonetheless significant to communicate information to someone else.
And yet, thinking about Butler's idea of gender performativity, it's not just myself that gets to determine these actions. And the famous, at least internet famous case we have is He Ma'am, the woman who screamed at the shop clerk for, calling her a sir when she is very clearly a ma'am.
Right.
But, the fact is that she wanted to be called a woman, and wanted to be seen as a woman, but then engaged in a variety of behaviors that she might not consider masculine, but the culture, the public, saw the way she behaved, and were like, no, you're a man.
Right. And I think that I think that what it means, again, what it means to be a man is to perform as a man, right? To act in the way that one does. And I think her response to that would probably be that there are certain characteristics that this person displayed, which we typically associate with men, but that these are not constitutive. She drew this distinction between sex and gender that a lot of people seem to have moved on from, and she would say that what you're recognizing as sex and what this person was performing was gender, specifically the gender of a woman, because being a woman constitutes a set of behaviors, and that's just what she means by gender, right? So there's a distinction. She drew the distinction between sex and gender, which a lot of people are now increasingly rejecting, which I find very interesting, because that was sort of the I want to say the philosophical foundation for a lot of the ideas about gender performativity that we have nowadays, right? That you've probably heard. This was in fact sort of the standard line about 10 years ago, which was that there's a difference between sex and your gender does not always match up with your biological sex, and therefore you perform as your gender, and that is what it means to be transgender. That was sort of the line about, I don't know, 2008, 2007 maybe.
Mm-hmm.
And that was all based on Butler. That's Butler is the origin of a lot of those ideas. But I don't know if you're familiar with a lot of modern discourse surrounding gender and sex and so on. But that's no longer... That's very taboo to talk that way now, because what is commonly embraced nowadays is the idea that, quite simply, there's no such thing as, or rather, not that there is no such thing as sex, but rather that sex is arbitrary, which is something that Butler never said.
Right.
That I think is the new development that has moved past performativity. I don't even think, although I could be wrong. No, I think I'm right on this. I don't even think anybody who advocates the notion that sex is arbitrary would say that sex is a performance, right? They would say that gender is a performance, but sex is not a performance. And I'm sorry, I've been rambling for like 5 minutes. We've completely lost the plot. Do you want to center me back in whatever the hell we were talking about?
Well, I kind of want to respond to what you said, because I think I find that kind of stuff interesting. But while you were talking, I kind of realized, a lot of the performative acts seem to have these culturally relative elements, right?
Yes.
And so that was a problem. That was a problem that we were kind of thinking might undermine Austin's entire point here. But we can think of certain acts that really are not culturally conditioned. And consider on every dollar bill, it says, this note is legal tender.
Yeah.
Now, you might disagree about the value of that legal tender. I might think a donut is worth $1. You might think it's worth $2. Like, so there is some distinction there. But the fact is, the government is imbued with this ability to say this piece of paper is worth more than the value of the piece of paper. And that seems like a certain speech act which is not culturally conditioned.
Hang on, I have to think about that. Maybe, but I'm not sure that's performative. I think the performative act is not the government decreeing it to be worth a certain value, but the fact that we use it as if it is a certain value, as if it has a certain value. The performative act is not the government saying it. The performative act is us using it, although now we're sort of getting away from language here. But so if the government says this dollar is worth this much, that seems to me to be not a constitutive statement. What's the word he uses? Constantive. No, that's a constantive statement.
No, you're right. Okay, that's
right. Yeah. If the government says this dollar is worth this much, that's something that is either true or false, right? If they said you will treat the dollar as if it is worth this much, that's an order, which is He sort of addresses imperatives briefly.
Yeah, imperatives seem like a gray area, but if the government just says this is legal tender, not decreeing a certain value, but saying, this is a form of currency, you might not like the US dollar for some reason. You might prefer to do all your transactions in Canadian dollars or the euro, but you have
Bitcoin.
Or Bitcoin. But but the mere act of the government saying this is a currency seems to make it a currency. Now, if suddenly the United States population were to say, you know what, we're not going to use the dollar, we're going to use Bitcoin. We don't recognize the value of the dollar. On the one hand, it might seem like, well, it's not a currency. So maybe the Speech Act didn't work or something. But it actually seems to me that what we're doing is actually we're kind of denying the authority of the US government, which, that raises a question. Like, if the captain names a ship, and then, I'm in the crowd and I say, well, I don't think that's the real captain. I don't think he has the authority to name the ship. I don't know. It seems to me that the Speech Act did happen. Although, if I'm right, maybe it was infelicitous.
What are you getting at more specifically?
I guess what I'm saying is that we're right. I think you raise a really good point in pointing out that Austin really doesn't do a good job where he tries. Although I don't think he tries that much to kind of protect against this cultural relativism point. But I think the general point he's getting at, that, we do recognize that there are statements that exist that are not nonsense, but that they don't describe the world. They actually seek to affect some change in the world.
Right.
There is a certain sense that that's solid.
Yeah, sure. But I think that there's another thing I want to raise about Austin's points that I found very interesting, which is, did you notice that all of the performative statements were self-referential? That was just something I noticed that I found very interesting. So, for example, when he says, I promise to pay you this amount of money, or I hereby name this ship the Queen Elizabeth, or I do this, that, or the other thing. There's no performative statements which seem to reference other people. That's just something I noticed that I wrote down that I found very strange. It seems as if we can only take speech acts that reference ourselves because we can only make statements about ourselves. Or rather, I'm trying to think of a good way to say this. We can only perform an act through speech if it references the speaker.
Right.
If I'm making any sense, right? Even in circumstances in which someone else is the direct object, you can't make a performative statement in which someone else is the subject. So, like, if I say, I can't say my mother promises to give you $5. That's no longer a performative statement. That's true or false.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
So I was looking through my notes, and that's something I wrote down. I found interesting that all of the performative statements reference oneself. There are no performative statements which reference anybody else.
Okay, what do you think of the example I brought up, which admittedly Austin did not bring up, but this note is legal tender?
I think that's not a performative statement. That's either true or false, because you say this note is legal tender. Well, what's the definition of? I suppose now we're getting into what's the definition of legal, and depending on what your definition of legal is, that may be true or false. But it is true or false, right? If you want to say the the note. I'm trying to think of a performative statement that the government actually makes, because that I do think is not performative. That's commands are sort of tricky, right? Because if you say you will use this note as legal tender, or use this note, maybe a better example because will sounds like a prediction, but you use this note as legal tender, or use this note as legal tender as an order. Is that a performative action? I think it is, but is in some sense self-referential, although this is probably stretching it a bit. I think that if you say, I order you to use this note as legal tender, you're doing the ordering, right? You can't make performative statements about third parties, right? So you can't say the government of China orders its citizens to use their notes as legal tender. Now that's no longer a performative act. That's either true or false. So I think that, again, imperatives are sort of tricky when we're determining whether or not they're self-referential. But I think in cases in which there's a clear statement of self-reference, or rather, performative statements generally have to have some kind of self-reference, whereas not constitutive. I keep forgetting the name. Not constitutive statements. Constitutive statements.
Yep.
Can be self-referential or can be referencing third parties. I found that an interesting point.
Now this is
go
now
ahead.
Related to this. An example you brought up before was kind of an ethical statement. So, yeah, murder is wrong. Is that a performative statement, or am I simply describing, I guess, a fact about the universe?
So you're getting to what I think is a disagreement between me and Austin, which is I would say that's not a performative statement because I think that statement is true or false. Austin, by contrast, was a logical positivist, and logical positivists in general tend to be very skeptical that ethical statements have any meaning at all.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a guy. Oh my gosh, what was his name? Oh, this is going to drive me crazy. But there's a school of thought called Noncognitivism, which is basically the idea that ethical statements don't express true or false things, right? And within that, there's a school of thought that is driving me crazy, and I'm trying to remember the name of it, and I'm now Googling it because I can't remember it. But there's a school of thought which essentially, within non-cognitivism, which essentially says that when I say murder is wrong, I'm actually saying boo murder. That's what I'm in fact saying, is or rather, I dislike murder. And it is not a true or false statement, but it is in fact not a sensible statement at all, right? It is not a well-formed proposition. It is simply not true or false. It just is. Right? It's a bit like saying boo or what time is it? Right? These don't express anything meaningful. They just
it's kind of like saying I like ice cream, which
is well, actually that's not a good example because that's true or false. I like ice cream is true or false. It's self-referential, right? But so I think a logical positivist would say, again, there's different schools within this. I think some of them would say that that saying murder is wrong is I don't like murder. That's the equivalent of it. But there's another school of thought. Oh my gosh, what was this guy's name? He lost his job at Yale over this. There was a philosopher, C.L. Stevenson. That was his name. He had a theory called emotivism, which was essentially so all logical positivists want to say that moral statements are subjective, right? Mm-hmm. They want to say that you can't really express moral truth. Some of them will say that when I say the sentence "don't murder," what I am in fact, or rather, murder is wrong, I'm in fact saying I think murder is bad. And in that case, I'm expressing a proposition, but it's not, and it is a it is a statement that can be true or false. It's a constitutive statement, but it's a statement about me. It's not a statement about the world. Emotivists don't even think that. They think that moral propositions are nonsense, right? They fall into the category of nonsensical statements. So the C.L. Stevenson's paper on this was basically arguing that when we say the sentence "murder is wrong," we just mean "boo murder." You say "boo murder" is not even "I don't like murder." That's just It's an expression of frustration. It's nothing, and that's what he and A.J. Ayer also essentially thought of moral statements. And I think Austin, when he's referring to moral statements, I found this very strange. He refers to ethical statements as performative, and I don't understand that at all, because, well, I suppose, I don't know, is boo murder performative? Like, if I say boo the Yankees, am I making a performative statement, or is that just nonsense? I have to think about that. I'm not sure. But yeah, I found his comments about ethical statements being performative to be very perplexing. Like, does he view them as imperatives? I don't know. He doesn't really discuss it. You've read the whole book, and I haven't, so maybe he discusses it later in the book. But
he mentions it later, but he doesn't really. The one place where I think he gets close to it is he talks about things like statements like, "I denounce murder."
Yeah.
So if we say murder is wrong is equivalent to "I denounce murder,"
right?
Sort of like a speech act. By saying "I denounce murder," I'm denouncing murder. Of course, no one actually says "I denounce murder." We just say murder is wrong. So if you're willing to say murder is wrong equals "I denounce murder."
Right. I think Austin, being familiar as I am with the school of thought with which he is associated, I think Austin would very much deny the proposition that murder is wrong as a statement about murder. It's a statement about something else. What that something else is, I'm not sure. But like most people, Ayer and Stevenson and a bunch of other people very much wanted to deny the idea that ethical propositions expressed things about the acts they condemned. So I suspect there's some of that going on in this. I'm just not sure how that applies to the concept of performative speech acts. Like, how is it performative to say murder is wrong? I don't know. So, did you want to talk about constatives with? I'm looking at. You sent me some notes. Constatives with implied acts. That chair is broken. Yeah.
So let's, So if I see that you're about to sit down in a chair,
yes,
and I point to the chair and I say that chair is broken.
Yeah.
Austin seems to suggest, and I forget if it's in chapter 2 or a little later, but he seems to suggest that actually is a speech act, which I thought was kind of strange because
he does say it in chapter 2, but
okay.
Yeah, I think. Are you familiar with Grice's axioms, by any chance? So
no, I'm not.
Grice's maxims. Sorry, Grice's maxims are things that are called they're called maxims of conversation, and basically they are. How do I put this? They're basic premises we accept going into a conversation. And I'm trying to remember all of them, and I don't remember all of them off the top of my head. But one of them is called the maxim of relevance. And by the way, this is one of the reasons it's so difficult to teach computers language, is you have to express only that which is relevant to the situation. And if you don't, this sort of breaks a rule of conversation. So, for example, if I unless it is somehow relevant to the situation. So, for example, if I say, I don't know, I'm trying to think of a decent example, and I can't off the top of my head, but
well, like if at a dinner party, it's cocktail hour and people are just milling around having cocktails, and no one is going to sit in that chair, and I just walk up to a group of people talking, and I say, that chair is, pointing to a chair that none of them were looking at, and I say,
that's a good example. Is that violates one of the maxims of conversation? Is if you go up to a bunch of that's a good example. If you go up to a bunch of people, point at a chair that no one's sitting in, and say that chair is broken, they'd all look at you very strangely, and they'd say, "Well, that's nice," and you violated some kind of societal taboo by noticing that. But by contrast, people assume, right, when they're speaking to you, that the notion that what you are saying is relevant. That sort of, with the conversation for Grice is sort of this agreement we enter into when we speak to each other, that we're going to give each other certain information and we have certain rules that we. So another one is don't say things you believe to be false, right? So if I tell you something that I believe is false, you'd get rather upset with me if you found out. Right. And in the same way, if you found out that I was telling you completely irrelevant things, then we couldn't have a conversation. It would derail rather quickly. And I think with respect to the chair example, right, that chair is broken. I think Grice would probably say he had this thing called conversational implicature, which is essentially the idea that following the maxim of relevance, the statement is interpreted to be relevant, generally speaking. Right. So if you, in your example, where you walked up to a bunch of people and you said, and you pointed to a chair no one was sitting in or intended to sit in and said that chair is broken, their response would probably be, well, no one is going to sit there, which is essentially saying, well, that contribution was not relevant to this conversation. And as a result, you assume that all contributions you make to a conversation are going to be relevant, and so does everyone else. So like if I say, I'm trying to think of something I can say to you, and again, it's hard for me to think of an example, but I'm trying to think of an example of something I could say to you in a conversation that is completely irrelevant, and you would draw an implication from that I'm not making at all. So if I said there's a chandelier, there's a loose chandelier above your head, is just the first thing that came to mind. I would be implying somewhat that it's dangerous and might fall on you, right? And you would probably move out of the way. But now suppose I said there's a loose chandelier above your head, but it's 3 stories up, and we're in a building, and it turns out the chandelier is technically above your head. It's just 3 stories up. You're going to move on the assumption that what I'm saying is relevant to you. And for the same reason, I think that's why Austin talks about statements like that as speech acts, right? Is essentially the idea that by the maxim of relevance, we assume that all contributions made to a conversation are going to be relevant to us, if that makes any sense. So it's sort of, it is not literally speaking, right? The exact meanings of the words do not mean that, but within the context of a conversation, they mean that. And Wittgenstein talks a lot about that, essentially, that sentences uttered in different contexts have different meanings, even if the words are exactly the same.
So what I guess the way I felt about these statements was that if you say that, okay, these are speech acts, because if you say that chair is broken, what you're really trying to do is affect, the person you're speaking to either not sit in the chair or get out of the chair or whatever.
Right.
That isn't everything a speech act, because in a sense, all language seems like the reason we use language is to create some kind of effect in, in the listener, right?
Well, yes and no. So, for example, I can communicate information to you that is not a speech act. So if I say if I say I met Bruce Willis yesterday, I'm not trying. Am I saying that with the intent to make you act, or are we just having a conversation? Am I saying something that you might be interested in? Right. I'm not trying to affect your behavior in any way. Right.
Well,
I'm just communicating information to you, or the answer to number 3 on the test is A. That's information that I'm communicating. That's not really a speech act, right? That's am I making any sense, or am I?
So what do you think of it? So would you agree that his example, that chair is broken, is not a speech act either?
No, I think that's a different circumstance because, well, again, it's a speech act if someone is about to sit on it. It is not a speech act if they are not. Do you follow me?
Yeah.
So in other words, I make that statement with the intention to stop them from sitting on it. That is definitely a speech act. But if I just make that statement, again, in your example, at a cocktail party, and I point to a chair in the corner and I say, that chair is broken, that's not a speech act. That's a statement about a chair. Because I'm not trying to affect action by doing so, I think is why he makes that distinction.
Okay. But say we're having a conversation, and I'm a big fan of Bruce Willis, and you see me losing interest in the conversation, so you say, by the way, I met Bruce Willis yesterday, in the attempt to bring me back into the conversation. Would then it become a speech act?
I think that's a fuzzy case. I don't know. I think, and this is me talking off the top of my head, so this very well could be wrong. I would think that if I said it with the intention to make you pay attention to me, then that is a speech act. But if I merely said it because I thought you would be interested in it, that is not a speech act. And that's where we sort of get into the subjective ideas about... I think... No, never mind. I was going to say something about felicity, but this is too complicated.
I guess what I'm saying is, if that's where we're going, if that's in a sense where we're forced to go, that, whether a statement is a constantive or performative based on an intention, that seems to undermine, where Austin starts, right? It seems to undermine the whole project.
You're right. Yeah. Ooh. Hang on. I'm thinking more about this. Okay, wait. If I'm Austin, how do I defend this? Is it a speech act for me to say I met Bruce Willis yesterday? If yeah, that's a problem. That's a pretty serious problem. I don't know.
See, if I were trying to defend Austin, I would say no, that's not a speech act. But then I would also have to throw out a lot of things like that chair is broken. That Austin does seem.
That I was gonna say. Then how do you defend the statement that chair is broken? Because that's the way I would do it. That's the only way I can think of to do it is to say there are relevant axioms of conversation, and I don't know. I'm thinking about. I really want to relate this to Grice, and I can, but it's basically. I don't know what the thing is. I read the whole thing and I still don't know what constitutes a speech act. It's fascinating. The more you read, the less you understand.
Well, that is part of the thing he does. You know, as you continue in the book, he kind of takes you through a few different schemes, and he says, well, this one has a lot of problems. So let's try something else. Well, okay, this one has problems too. And so kind of by the end, he kind of gets to this point where he's like, look, the reality is we know these things are there, and I think we need more exploration of these things. But I'm not sure we're ever going to get to a solid ground.
It's very possible that there is no solid ground to get to. I mean, this is one of the things I'm reminded of Kripke's discussions about, or rather Kripke's responses to Quine when it comes to ideas about essential properties. So one of the things that drove Quine crazy was the idea of there being a difference between incidental and essential properties, right? There's something that makes a being essentially human, and there's something else that makes it incidentally human. So the essential properties of a human might be that I have human DNA, and an incidental property of being a human might be that I have brown hair, right? But because if I didn't have brown hair, I'd still be human. The problem is that gets very dicey. Right, and that Quine really, really hated that. And Kripke, in Naming and Necessity, essentially forced us to accept the concept of essential properties. Right, in order to be who you are, there are certain essential properties that make you you, but there are certain incidental properties that could be different, and you would still be you.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where we get into a lot of ambiguity that a lot of people are not comfortable with. And I think language is very much the same way. There are just certain areas of philosophy of language that you have to accept are murky, that are just not entirely clear. And as a result, it helps to illustrate very clear examples, but there are circumstances in which examples are somewhat unclear. Like in the Bruce Willis case we were talking about earlier, I don't know what the answer to that is, and it may not have a definite answer. But the fact that it doesn't have a definite answer does not necessarily mean that this is not a concept worth exploring, because there's some interesting ideas here between the idea that merely by saying something we perform an action. I think we philosophers tend to use clear cases when illustrating these things and avoid the murky cases, because they're trying to communicate a concept, and these are just examples, and there might be marginal cases. But the important thing I think that Austin was trying to get across is he tried to use clear examples in order to illustrate that merely by speaking we can perform certain actions. I think that's the point.
Now, this is, this was in part of the notes I put under the second Roman numeral. But so one way I thought that you could kind of rescue kind of an attempt at a hard line, and Austin doesn't go here, and maybe it's kind of my Catholic background. I have this, kind of, language gets to be kind of magical, among Catholics, but for me, what really struck me about Austin was the idea that by speaking, you actually create a promise, that the promise now exists.
Yeah.
And so it seems to me that creation seems to be the line between the murky examples and, the clear examples. So like, I promise creates a promise. I take this woman, there is now a marriage where there wasn't one. I name this ship, that's a little fuzzier, but you're creating the name, I guess, or the relate.
But then, I would have to think that under this, you actually said that in the notes. I was going to say you'd have to reject the example that Austin gives, right? You'd have to say that chair is broken does not constitute a speech act,
right?
Or you'd even have to say don't sit in that chair is not a speech act. Which is, I'm not so sure about that. But I take your point that in all the cases you listed, right? I promise I take this woman to be my wife. I name this ship so and so. I promise to pay you 6 pence tomorrow if it rains. You're creating something that did not previously exist. I think in that case, yeah, that might actually be a plausible defense of Austin. I'm trying to think of problems with that, and I I can't think of any off the top of my head. That's actually a pretty good way of maybe throwing out the bathwater and keeping the baby when it comes to Austin. That
it does limit the number of speech acts, like,
considerably.
Yeah, imperative statements, which Austin kind of just assumes they're speech acts. Don't sit in that chair.
Right, and that's why I said the only common thread I can find among all of the speech acts is essentially that they're either that they try to affect some kind of behavior. Right. In most cases, it's your behavior. Right. If you say "I promise," you're making a commitment to behave a certain way, and in the same way that if you say "Don't sit in that chair," you're trying to affect the behavior of someone else. That's what if I had to take one common theme among all the examples he gave, that was the theme I took away, that you're trying to affect the behavior of others with the acts you perform. But the problem with that is you're quite right that relies entirely on intention, which is sort of undermines Austin's whole point. Specifically the idea that, actually, now that I think about it, how does it undermine Austin's whole point? Right? If we base everything on the intention of the speaker, why does that undermine Austin's general argument? Or rather, Austin's general distinction between performative acts and constative acts.
Well, I don't know. I guess it struck me that, at least in the early chapters, although he backs away from this a little later, he really does try to get this point across, that there are some language constructions that are in themselves speech acts, performative statements.
Right.
The example, I promise you I'll pay you back. Is there a way that you could say that as a descriptive statement? As a constantive?
I mean, rather tortuously, yes. Which is, you could say, it is true that I will return this money to you based on the knowledge I have at the present. If you want to rephrase a promise, you could do that, but I don't find that very plausible, because you're not really making, when you say saying I promise is fundamentally different from prediction.
Right.
It seems to me you're not predicting something. You're making a commitment. But I think if you really wanted to, although I don't particularly want to, you could come up with a constative interpretation for everything.
Now he does say that there does seem to be a loose relationship to grammatical sense in later chapters, and he says that if instead of saying I promise you, I am promising you, that seems to be closer to a constative statement. But that gets to his point, that it's like you have to change the actual language.
Yeah, that's why I don't find this whole constative rephrasing of those kinds of statements particularly convincing, and I don't think anybody else would either, right? Because a promise seems to be fundamentally different from a prediction, right? It seems to be fundamentally different from saying that something is true or false. Now, it is true to say that you promised it, right? If you say, I promise to pay you back, it is true that I made a promise, but it is not the same. But it is not true when I say I promise that I'm saying I will have made a promise. I'm sorry if I got sort of tongue-tied there, but I hope the point is clear. That the statement I promise is not true or false. The statement I promise seems to be fundamentally different. I think in that sense, Austin is generally right. But the point I was making earlier was about statements
yeah, the
go ahead.
intention, and that's where I was going with that, is that if we say that the difference is really all about intention, then it would seem to be the case that I could say, I promise you that, X, and then, when you call me on it, I say, well, I intended that as a statement of fact, not as a speech act.
I don't even know what does it mean to intend a promise as a statement of fact, like as a prediction, or what do you mean by saying I promise is a statement of fact?
Well, yeah, I guess the response there is just then, well, you used words wrong.
Yeah, it that seems to be a non-starter to me.
Yeah, if you truly did mean it as a statement of fact, then in a sense what happened is you accidentally committed a speech act, which is weird.
Right. I don't think anybody would find that particularly plausible. But you have a note here. Sorry, what was your issue with the intention view that I had? I'm not clear on that.
I guess what the issue with intention is that it seems to think that the difference between speech act and non-speech act rests in the intention of the speaker.
I mean, that's the other that seems to me to be the only alternative to your view with respect to creation, right? The creative act is what makes the performative act. I think the only alternative to that is that performative act is dependent upon the intention of the speaker, and that incorporates all of Austin's previous examples. But you mentioned earlier that undermines his general point. How does it undermine his general point?
Well, maybe you just responded to it, which is, maybe that's the case, that there are some statements that it's impossible to intend them as constantive statements, like I promise. And there are some statements that, are intention malleable. That chair is broken.
Yeah. I think that if you want to incorporate, I think if you want to be the most faithful to Austin's view, I think that's the view you have to take. I have to say, though, I do prefer your opinion that performative speech acts constitute creative acts. That's quite beautiful. But I think that
it's not what
what he said.
Yeah.
that would be very nice, but it's not what he said. But that's an idea worth exploring. The notion that a creative act constitutes a performative act, that it is something which is neither true nor false, but is the creation of something new. That well, I don't know. Anyway, you had a note here about performative function of language. Do you want to talk about is the performative? So it says here, is the performative a function of language, a function of human understanding? Could languages exist with only descriptive statements, only performative statements? So the answer is yes. Well, could a language exist with only descriptive statements? Yes. Is the short answer. I see no reason why not. It just wouldn't be a very interesting language, right? So we could describe. Although actually, I think if you take my previous statement about having intentions seriously, right, and you apply it to Austin's theory, it would be hard for humans to speak that language, right? Because you can't. It's very difficult to speak language without intending to affect the behavior of others. Right? At some point, you have spoken language with you. Like even if it's just "I'd like a hamburger, please," you're intending to affect the behavior of others. even if the statement is literally true. So, could a language exist? The answer is technically yes, but if it's the intentions that make the statements true, then the answer is no, because humans are always going to have intentions to affect the behavior of others. And you put a note here, which is computer language, that I think is very interesting.
Yeah, so you brought up computers earlier.
I did?
And I think so, yeah. We were talking...
I don't recall bringing it up, but go on.
Okay.
I'm glad I thought of it. Go on.
Yeah, it was just a side note. You said that it's very difficult for computers to understand speech because, in a sense, all language is relevant to them.
Right. Computers have difficulty. This was in relation to Grice's Maxims. One of the difficulties with teaching computers language is that computers have a very difficult time parsing what is relevant information and what is not, and as a result, they either give you too much information or not enough, and they don't understand what is precisely the correct amount. That's a very subjective human thing. But as it comes to performative statements, I don't know. Can computers make performative statements?
Well, I was just thinking. Well, I mean, to talk about how a computer interprets speech is kind of a weird concept, suggesting that a computer interprets. But it does something like interpreting, where you give it an input and it creates an output.
Right.
But it seems to me that computers, in a sense, quote unquote, interpret all language as performative, in that if you give a computer an input, it knows it has to create an output.
Yeah.
This is assuming we're taking on, like, Austin's view of imperatives being speech acts. Right. So, when I was thinking, so I put these, all these different things under, kind of one heading, but maybe they're two different questions. But so, is the performative a function of language or a function of human understanding? So what I was kind of getting with that was the idea of, like, using the kind of case of a promise or something. The way I was thinking about it is, like, the promise actually exists somewhere in the world. I know it's a weird way of talking about it, but once you make the promise stops being a verb and becomes a noun. Right. But I mean, that is a weird way of talking about it, because if we say, where does it exist, then we have to say, well, it's kind of in human understanding, right?
Yeah, you have to. I think you could just say it's an abstract object, in the same way that numbers are abstract objects, or right. Promises are not tangible things, but they do exist. Sure.
So, I mean, it seems to me like, if I promise, like, it's clear that promises seem to exist, at least in every language I'm aware of.
Right.
Maybe there's a language that weirdly doesn't have any word for "I promise" or something like that. But it seems to me that all humans kind of have some understanding that, if you make a promise, you're doing something.
Right.
So the question for me then was, well, it seems to me that if promises are this universal, then it's not like a quirk of any particular language that we have promises.
Right.
So if promises do exist, I don't want to say outside of language, but in a way preceding language.
Yeah.
Then is it possible to create a language that doesn't include promises? Or
or do you mean performative statements rather than promises? Using promises as an example. So exactly. Can you create a language that is that has no performative statements. I have to think about that. So it's interesting when you said computer languages, I thought you were saying computer languages were an example of a language that contains no performative statements because computers don't talk like that.
Well, the computer language I actually thought was only performative, but perhaps because we're thinking about it from a different perspective.
When you talk to a computer, the computer will produce an output, and therefore it interprets language performatively. But when the computer produces an output based on the intention standpoint that I was getting at earlier, computers don't have intentions when they produce outputs. They just produce outputs.
Right.
And as a result, in that sense, computers, you might say computers interpret all inputs as performative and give all outputs as constative. That they view things as either true or false. They produce outputs that are either true or false and without the intention to affect behavior. Right? Computers, as far as I know, yet don't have those sort of intentions to affect behavior, and moreover, computers don't. Even under your other definition, sort of the creative aspect, that in order for a statement to be a performative statement, there has to be something that is created. Computers can't create promises. They can't create commitments or bargains or anything like that. And as a result, I would say that the inputs into a computer are interpreted as performative, but the outputs are all constative, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, that's a good way of putting it, which is really interesting.
Yeah. Now, as far as it's an interesting question whether computers. I would think computers can talk to each other, and I think there are certain examples of computers talking to each other, and in that sense, like for example, you can program two computers to speak to each other nonstop, and
right.
in that conversation, I would think that all in one sense, all of the statements made would be constative, right? Because the computers are not actually trying to affect. One, computers aren't actually trying to affect the behavior of the other computer, and two, under the other definition we have about creative acts, creative speech acts, right? In other words, creating something that wasn't there before, constituting performative acts. They're not trying to do that either. So in that sense, two computers talking to each other is sort of the perfect example of a constitutive statement in which everything they say is either true or false. Right. So if a computer, even if the computer outputs, I promise you this, that, or the other thing, that statement is false. And you say, how could a promise be false? Very simple. It's not promising you anything. When a computer says I promise, it is lying. When a human says I promise, that the mere act of saying that makes it true. I think is a very interesting way of thinking about it. I never thought about it that way. But yes, in some sense, the computer is not creative something, and also it's lying. So the statement from a computer, I promise to do XYZ, is false. Even if it ends up doing XYZ, by the way. So if a computer says, I promise to produce the output 2, and subsequently produces the output 2, the statement, I promise to produce the output 2, was false, because the computer is not promising anything, even if it ultimately delivered on the promise if we ascribe intentions to a computer, which a computer does not have.
So if I were to say, hey Siri, wake me up at 6 p.m. tomorrow.
Yes.
Okay, I set an alarm for 6 p.m.
Okay. That's weird.
That statement is true. Siri did set an alarm for 6 p.m. But if Siri says, I will wake you up at 6 p.m. tomorrow, there's a performative way of interpreting that and a constitutive way of interpreting that. The performative way of interpreting that is, I commit myself to waking you up tomorrow, which is something that Siri can't say, because Siri does not have intentions. But by contrast, if you say, I will wake you up tomorrow at 6 a.m.
If it's a prediction.
Yes, if it's a prediction, right, which is the other way of reading that statement, then that statement is true, or at least I presume it's true. Like I don't, unless your phone dies or something. But yeah, in general, that's still a statement that can be analyzed as true or false. In the other case, the other way of analyzing the statement doesn't make any sense when applied to a computer. Right.
Well, what's really cool about this is that we've kind of distinguished between human beings and computers, kind of as saying humans are the kind of things that can have intentions, that can can make and keep promises, or break promises.
Well, that gets a little tricky, particularly when computers can certainly act as if they have intentions and act as if they make promises and so on. And that gets us into a broader discussion about what it really means for a computer to be intelligent or to be sentient.
Right.
But I think that as of right now, at time of recording, computers do not have intentions. And as a result, I think it's fairly safe to say that a computer cannot make a promise, which means that if you had a conversation between two computers, it is reasonable to say that every statement between them could be described as purely descriptive statement, as having a value that is either true or false. So, yeah, in response to your question, could a language exist with only descriptive statements? The answer is yes. But it would have to be a language that is had between two beings which have no intentions whatsoever. They don't intend anything; they just produce outputs. In terms of could a language exist spoken by humans? Probably not. I mean, I put it this way: I actually do think it could, but so Suppose I made you a promise, but the promise was in Chinese, a language I do not speak. And I parroted the words in Chinese, right? I promise to wake you up at 6 a.m. tomorrow. I wouldn't have actually made that sort of gets us back to the felicity. That I think is what's behind the discussion about. Actually, no, I don't. I lied. That might be what's behind the discussion of felicity. This might be an element to the discussion of felicity. I don't think it's the sole component. But one of them is intention. Right? If you wander into a wedding and randomly say, I do, without the intention of actually marrying anyone, then you didn't actually make a promise. And in a similar sense, if I parrot the words in Mandarin Chinese, I promise to wake you up at 6 a.m. tomorrow, I'm not actually making a promise. So in that sense, I don't have an intention when I say such a thing. And as a result, the lack of my intention is what makes that an infelicitous statement or an infelicitous performative act. And well, in that sense, yeah, go ahead.
I think this goes to your argument about intentions being so important, because if we go to, you brought up Chinese, and so I immediately thought of John Searle's Chinese room argument.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting, like if we imagine, the guy in the box where he's got, the Chinese dictionary, and so he gets a note that says, I promise to the person on the other side of the box that that I'll wake them up at 6 a.m. tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
And the guy transcribes it and hands it to the other guy on the side of the box. If I'm aware of the process that just happened, I don't say, oh, the guy inside the box is the person who promised me, even if he created this, the speech.
Right. Exactly. He's reproducing the speech without intention, and as a result, it's the intention that makes the promise. Yeah. So I think intention is an important aspect of performative statements. Again, which essentially, I feel like we've been using a lot of this jargon. We defined it at the beginning of the stream, but just to review, performative statements are those statements which communicate something meaningful, but which are not themselves true or false. And I think in order to communicate something meaningful, they must the person making the statement must have an intention to communicate something. And if they lack the intention, then they have only made a descriptive statement. They haven't made a performative statement. So I think that's the critical aspect to get straight with respect to descriptive and not descriptive, constantive and performative state. Constantive is a stupid term.
Yeah, it is.
I just it was the 50s. Anyway, let me just take a look at what you wrote here. Does performative and constantive describe particular sentences or understandings of those sentences? We sort of went over that with the chair example, I think. That the answer is it describes it describes in general the understanding. So you wrote an example here which I'm slightly confused by, which is the eagle has left the nest. I'm slightly confused about why that statement is either performative. Well, so the eagle has left the nest can mean different things when uttered by a bird watcher or by a CIA agent.
Yeah.
And I think I'm now seeing what I think was the distinction you were trying to get at here, which again has to do with our previous discussion of intention when it comes to performative statements. So the bird watcher saying the eagle has left the nest has no intention to affect behavior, whereas the CIA agent does. I think the difficulty you're going to have with your account about creative statements, right? The idea that in order to perform something, you're creating something that was not previously there, is how the hell do you explain this? Like, what do you mean the eagle has left the nest? Is that a performative act? You'd have to say no, right?
Yeah, I would have to say no. And the way I'd say it is, sure, you're intending to essentially you're treating whoever you're talking to almost as a computer. You want them to create a certain output, but what you're giving them is a descriptive statement. The eagle has left the nest, whatever that refers to when you're a CIA agent. Maybe the mobster has left the bar.
Yeah.
You're describing, and so it's a constitutive statement that this is what is occurring, and then if someone else acts on that, that's kind of on them. Now, yes, I do have an intention to do that. So Austin would probably call that, essentially say that what's going on there is a performative act,
provided we had some plan when that sentence was uttered,
right?
To do something, right? So if I say the eagle has left the nest, and then as soon as I say that your job is to go in guns blazing, then yeah, that's a performative act according to Austin, but on your view, it's not. And then the other example you gave was the defendant is guilty when uttered by a juror versus uttered by a reporter.
And this one is slightly different. Is slightly different from the above case, because with the eagle has left the nest, but compared to a bird watcher versus when a CIA agent says it, you could say, well, okay, really what's going on there is that there are two different statements using the same vocalizations. It's a code, essentially. Whereas the defendant is guilty, those words are kind of understood in the same way. It's not a code when a juror says it or when a reporter says it. They're both saying the same thing and meaning those words in the exact same way. But because of the juror's role, when he says technically, I'm giving away the game by saying that it's, the juror would actually say, we find the defendant guilty. Yes. But suppose he were to just say in his role as a juror, the defendant is guilty.
Yeah.
That there is a sense where it's the same statement, but when it's a juror, it's a speech act. But when it's a reporter, just reporting the fact, oh, the jury found the defendant guilty.
Yeah. So wait. Under your view that you were articulating earlier, what has been created that wasn't?
If you will, the
sentence. The verdict, rather.
Yeah, the verdict was created, or you could say it's you could say that the jury, by finding the defendant guilty, has actually transformed in some kind of essential sense, or at least
transform this. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Or at least in some kind of socially agreed upon sense that we take it as an essential sense. The guilt that was previously in question, we have now introduced as fact. We have created a guilty man. Or
okay,
we have created a convict, if you will.
I see what you're getting at here. I think that's. I'm trying to think of something I could add to that. I don't have much else to say. That's a fair. That's an interesting way of putting things, and I think that's. I will say, perhaps one sort of. Well, never mind. I was going to say one monkey wrench I could sort of throw in there would be the fact that the only thing you're quote unquote creating is in the context of a trial which itself is reaching a result rather than creating something. So to give you sort of a different idea, if I say if I say so, for example, if I say Fermat's last theorem is true before Fermat's last theorem was proven, that's not really a speech act, is it? Right? It's you're making a statement about mathematics, and in the same way, when you say the defendant is guilty, you're making a statement about the defendant. You're not creating something, right? In the same way that when I say Fermat's last theorem is true, I'm not creating anything. I'm just making a factual statement about Fermat's last theorem. And you could say the juror is doing the same thing. Now you could add like a subjective qualifier to that. So you could say, I believe that the defendant is guilty. But in the same way, you could say, I believe that Fermat's last theorem is true. Right? It's not entirely clear to me what separates right, because think about it this way. The reporter, I could phrase a lot of things in terms of creation. The reporter is creating a story. And if the reporter says the defendant is guilty as part of a news story, the reporter is creating a news story in which the reporter is reporting that there was a guilty defendant in the courtroom. You could say, and you might say, that the juror is the causal origin of this chain of events, and therefore his act is somehow different. But you could also say that about the defendant. You could say the defendant is the causal origin of this chain of events because he committed a crime. And the juror, that caused the juror to pronounce him guilty, which caused the reporter to report the story. And the reporter is pronouncing that statement in order to create a news story. And right, so I think there's some ambiguity in terms of what constitutes a creative action and what doesn't. So do you have any feedback as to why the reporter is not creating a news story in much the same sense that the juror is creating a verdict?
Well, the difference, I guess, would come to an interpretation of what the juror is actually doing. Because if the juror is simply supposed to give his opinion about whether he thinks the defendant actually committed the act he's accused of, or not, then I would agree. But in fact, it seems to me that the juror is actually somehow participating in some kind of act which we as a society recognize as authoritative, whereby he can change the way we treat the man based on his status as defendant versus convict. Once he's been convicted, we can essentially strip him of his rights. Like, I mean, at least some of his rights. Like, we can put him in jail,
And
regardless of whether he committed the act or not.
right.
Whereas, you know, it might happen that, you know, people start treating the man differently based on the fact that there was a news story about him.
Yeah, that's where I was going next. Was it's very easy for me to come up with my own story about what the reporter is creating and the effects that the reporter's actions will have.
But it's but
yeah,
we seem to recognize some effect, you know, some sense in which in a sense the reaction to the man by the people who read the news story is only accidentally caused by the reporter. In other words, it's not like if I read a news story, I have to do this. Whereas if the jury comes to the decision that this man is guilty, regardless of whether it's true or not, you know, that the man becomes a convict by
social convention, in the same way that people react to the reporter's story by social convention. I mean, I suppose if the jurors could say, "I pronounce this man guilty," the judge could hypothetically say, you know what? We're just going to let him go. Yeah, he's guilty. Screw it. Right? But that doesn't happen. But my point is that in much the same way, it's ultimately the people's choice. In much the same way, it is ultimately everyone else's choice what to do with the guy. So they are bound by certain societal structures to treat him in a certain way as a convict. But the public is bound by certain societal structures that are perhaps not legal structures, but that are socialized to treat convicts in a particular way. And in some sense, the reporter is causing the convict to be treated in that way by pronouncing him guilty to the public. I don't know if I'm making any sense here, but do you see what I'm saying? Is you need to find the thing is, I'm going to be honest, I like your idea a lot more than Austin's, but I think that you're going to have to block this move. You have to find a way that I can't tell the same creation story about somebody else, right? So yeah, you're creating a verdict, and he's now going to be a convict, and all social conventions mandate that we now treat him as a convict. But, you know, the reporter's creating a story which is going to be spread to the public, and all social conventions mandate that the public treat him in a certain way, and so on. But I'm not entirely sure what that distinction is going to be. But I think that's sort of the issue that's going to come up whenever you try and say some sort of creation idea. There's going to be a question of, well, what exactly is being created in a given circumstance, and how do we distinguish creation from non-creation? I think is a question I don't have the answer to.
Yeah, I mean, you know, maybe I do need to go back to the drawing board a little bit, but I do think there is some sense in which, you know, we recognize, like, the juror's role in pronouncing guilt or innocence is taken, or at least we recognize that it should be taken more seriously than a reporter's role.
Sure. Yeah.
And I mean, it's tough because there is, you know, we also recognize that, you know, cases can sometimes get overturned on appeal. So, you know, does the juror create the guilty man? Yeah. But the convict, I guess the question is, when a case is overturned on appeal and, you know, the man is found innocent on appeal, do we say, oh, he was never guilty in the first place? You know, he was never actually a convict. The jury misspoke.
Right.
Or the jury was wrong. Or do we say the jury the jury did a speech act. Okay, so I'm confusing things, but there are three possibilities that when a case gets overturned like that. We could either say, one, the jury was making a constitutive statement that the defendant committed the crime. We found that statement to be false.
Mm-hmm.
Two, we could say, and because of that, other people have done certain things, and so it was never a speech act in the first place. Two, we could say it was a speech act, but because the circumstances were wrong, in fact, the man was innocent, not guilty, it was an unfelicitous speech act.
But the felicity, it seems to me, that's not. I don't think that's what Austin means by felicity, because it seems to me if a jury comes to a conclusion, they have every right to come to that conclusion, right? It's not like the circumstance in which some random guy goes up to the Queen Elizabeth and says, "I hereby dub this ship the Queen Elizabeth." This is a circumstance in which the people who have the authority to pronounce someone guilty are pronouncing someone guilty.
And that's where I'm going, which is why I think it's the third possibility, which is what happened was the jury did a speech act. They said, this man is guilty.
Mm-hmm.
And in doing so, they transformed the defendant into a convict. And then if on appeal, another jury finds the man innocent, then the convict has been transformed back into a free man, we might say.
Okay. Then I suppose here's the difficulty I'm having, right? Suppose someone, we're not naming any names here, goes on television and pronounces someone else to be a rapist, like some prominent public figure. Says so and so is a rapist with no evidence and for no reason. The question is that a speech act? Because they're in much the same way that the juror is convicting someone and is creating a verdict. Isn't that, I don't know, reporter now causing someone to be treated in a certain way? Like, I am making this person guilty in the eyes of the public. Does that make any sense?
So I think you're right. There is some ambiguity there. But we might resolve this by saying there are two ways we could interpret that. And it does rely on intention, as you say. So we could say the person who goes on TV and says this man is a rapist is merely describing that man.
Yeah.
And if so, then it's not a speech act, it's a constitutive statement. Or we could say that when they go on TV and say this man is a rapist, what they're trying to do is to change the man into a convict, or at least so if it's that case, I would say it's an unfelicitous speech act because it's not the proper person to do so.
Okay. I think I see what you're getting at. There's some strains of thought that need to be separated here that I'm getting a bit tired to sort out. But yeah, I think I understand the general distinction you're trying to draw. It gets murky, as all things do. In this particular area of philosophy. Anyway, if you don't mind, I'm probably going to go to bed soon.
Yeah, no problem. Before you go, was there anything else you found interesting, or anything else you wanted to address?
Not especially. I will say you might want to update the description, because the description currently says that you're going to be speaking to 2 PhDs in philosophy, and it
Yeah,
turns
yeah.
out one of them didn't show up, and I don't have a PhD yet. So
Yes, sorry, I thought you had it already, but
no. I may have misspoke earlier, but no, I'm studying, but do not have it.
Yeah, I'll update that.
Are you sure the other guy with the unpronounceable name has one, or you misunderstood? Like
I might double check with him, but
yeah.
I thought he did, but
he might just be a grad student like me. Anyway, and then as far as this whole YouTube thing, I was thinking of posting. Well, you know what? We should probably go off the air because I don't think anybody wants to hear this. But I was thinking of starting to post content. So if maybe if you want to keep an eye on anything I have to post in the future, you should feel free to subscribe. That's my shameless plug at the end of the live stream.
Let me just make sure. Let me plug your channel. So I think you said you wanted to change the channel name to Sense with Frege.
Sense of Frege.
Sense of Frege.
It's a philosophy of language joke, yeah. And I did actually with Google. So I did change the name, but the YouTube name has not updated yet.
Yeah,
for reasons it apparently takes a while to update, and I changed it this morning.
So it's so Frege is currently YouTubing at Nona Yo Business.
That was a placeholder name. I didn't actually intend for that. But yeah, that's the Sense of Frege is going to be the channel if I could eventually figure out how to get Google to cooperate.
Yeah, and I'll put a link in the description when I update everything else as well.
I would appreciate that very much.
All right.
Thank you. It's been fun. Hopefully we can get that third guy on, whatever his name is.
Yeah, definitely. Okay. So thanks everyone. Hope you liked it. If you did, please like, subscribe both to my channel and to Frege's. Again, links will be in the description. And yeah, go with God.
Cool.